Donald Trump has said over and over again, the U.S. is subsidizing Canada.
We are subsidizing Canada to the tune of over $100 billion a year.
The United States is subsidizing Canada. As I called him, Governor Trudeau, I said, listen, what would happen if we didn't subsidize you? Because we give them a lot of money. It's very unfair.
But what does Trump mean exactly? Subsidizing Canada to the tune of over $100 billion a year. And is it true? We should start by saying that everyone is partly guessing what Trump means when he talks about the U.S. subsidizing Canada, because he hasn't actually explained where he's getting this $100 billion number from. And the number sometimes changes with a whole bunch of other grievances getting thrown into the pot.
Why are we supporting a country, $200 billion plus a year? Our military is at their disposal. All of these other things, they should be a state.
But let's pick up on what appears, at least most of the time, to be driving this claim about the U.S. subsidizing Canada, and that's the trade imbalance between the two countries.
Donald Trump has always been obsessed with trade balances, trade surpluses and deficits, and the fact that the U.S. has a trade deficit.
We're spending hundreds of billions a year to take care of Canada. We lose in trade deficits.
A trade deficit happens when country A imports more from country B than it exports. And Trump's right on one central point. The U.S. does have an ongoing trade deficit with Canada. And that's been the case for years. Canada has, in fact, sold more goods to the United States than the U.S. has sold to Canada. And zooming in on 2023, for example, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the hard numbers are pretty clear. Canada exported $427 billion worth of goods to the U.S., while the U.S. exported $355 billion worth of goods to Canada. The difference between those two numbers, about 72 billion U.S., or about 100 billion Canadian.
He talks about, I'm a trader, I love trade, I want so much trade, but it has to be fair. But what he means by fair is that if the U.S. has a surplus, it's fair. If the U.S. has a deficit, it's unfair.
So maybe that's where Trump is getting this $100 billion figure from. Except if that's the case, it's misleading. Because what I just showed you was the trade deficit in goods, physical things. But think of all the other things that Americans sell to Canadians, from financial services, telecommunications, air transport, consulting, hell, even Netflix.
It's very important to look at services as well, because services has been a growing part of trade for many decades now.
Yes, any honest accounting of a trade imbalance must take services into account, because that's trade. And when you look at that balance sheet in services, the U.S. actually has a surplus over Canada of about $32 billion U.S., which doesn't wipe out the deficit in goods, but it certainly pulls the two countries a little closer together. The actual total trade imbalance between Canada and the U.S. is about $40 billion U.S., or 57 billion Canadian in Canada's favor. But let's set aside the number, because, like I said at the start, I don't know if it's clear to anyone where Trump is getting his numbers from, because he hasn't explained it, even when asked. But there is a bigger question here about how Trump appears to be framing the trade imbalance as some sort of subsidy to Canada.
So I think what he's saying implicitly, we're giving more dollars to Canada than they're spending in the U.S. And he thinks that's a subsidy.
He's just saying the very fact that there's a trade deficit shows that we must be subsidizing things in some fashion. And that's not the case.
Right, because when we think of subsidies, we tend to think of handouts, right? Except it's not like the U.S. is just sending Canada $40 billion a year for nothing in return. Like, when I buy a $6 jar of mayonnaise from Walmart, that's not a subsidy. I'm buying mayonnaise. And Americans are simply buying more from Canada than Canadians buy from Americans. And experts we spoke to say that's not necessarily a bad thing.
There's nothing inherently good or bad about a trade surplus or a deficit. The United States has had a trade deficit pretty much since the end of the Second World War. Why is that? Because they're richer than any other country, so they buy more stuff.
And consider this, the US's $40 billion trade deficit with Canada pales in comparison to its trade deficit with many other countries. Just look at how much more the US buys from China each year, for example. That gap is more than $250 billion.
So Canada only accounts for about 5% of the overall U.S. deficit just in terms of traded goods. It's not even in the top 5 countries that have a larger surplus.
But let's go one level deeper with Trump's argument, because what he's actually been trying to get across is that the U.S. doesn't actually need any of the stuff it's buying from Canada, and that it's only been buying Canadian products to essentially help Canada out. That's the subsidy.
We're doing it because of habit, and we're doing it because we like our neighbors, and we've been good neighbors. But we can't do it forever. You know, they make 20% of our cars. We don't need that. I'd rather make them in Detroit.
And it's not just cars. It's also
lumber. We have massive fields of lumber. We don't need their dairy products. We have more than they have. We don't need anything.
So now we're starting to understand his point, that he believes the U.S. can and should produce all of these things domestically instead of paying Canada for them.
The America First movement, not just Trump, but the America First movement and the economists who are part of it are fixated on the deficit as synonymous with job loss in the U.S.
And that's certainly an argument you can make from industry to industry. If you set aside the notion that the whole reason you buy things instead of make things is because making things is often more expensive. But if Trump really believes that the U.S. buys too much from Canada, he is leaving one big thing out. The one daily purchase that makes up about a quarter of everything Americans buy from Canadians. The U.S. produces more crude oil than any other country in the world, around 13 million barrels a day. But for its own citizens, it needs more than that, about 20 million barrels a day. And it can't even efficiently use a big chunk of what it does produce, because historically, American refineries have been set up to process a different, heavier kind of oil than American drillers can find in their own shale deposits. So that's an expensive problem. But you know who produces exactly the kind of heavy crude oil America needs? You guessed it. The U.S. buys the majority, around 60% of the crude oil it needs from Canada. And on some level, it makes sense. Canada is a relatively stable energy partner. Pipelines make transporting oil a lot easier.
Because of the distance, because of pre-existing supply chain links, because of transportation routes. This is why Canada and the U.S. trade the most.
And one other way to look at Canada's trade surplus.
If you remove oil, we're now running a trade deficit with the United States.
It's largely one commodity in our case. And that commodity is not putting Americans out of work. It's putting Americans to work.
Putting Americans to work because of what I just mentioned a few moments ago, that there is an entire industry built around the importation of heavy Canadian crude and all the American workers who process and refine that oil domestically.
Oil and gas is probably one of the best examples of how something that is responsible for a huge trade deficit is actually creating tens of thousands of jobs in the U.S.
Now, Trump has signaled that he intends to ramp up domestic drilling too. But to use all of that oil domestically, there would have to be a significant and expensive retooling of America's refining capacity as well. That doesn't happen overnight. So in the meantime, Americans buy a ton of oil from Canada. And that is the single biggest driver of the trade deficit that Donald Trump says is a big, big problem.
If it were to be interrupted, I know it would harm Canada, but it also would get the attention, I think, of U.S. policymakers because there are parts of and regions of the U.S. that very much depend on those imports.
So, yes, the U.S. has a trade imbalance with Canada. No, that doesn't mean the U.S. is subsidizing Canada's economy. But yes, Trump can and will likely continue to argue that it should be buying less from Canada and producing more at home. How easy that is to actually do is one question. Another is how much of all of this is just part of one long, dramatic negotiation.